Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture. We'd like to offer a special welcome to all of those who have joined us from Peace Lutheran Church in Cold Spring. We're glad you are here tonight with us. Some, or perhaps many of you, have seen the 2016 movie Silence, directed by Martin Scorsese, in the theaters upon its release a couple years ago. Some of you may have attended the film screening and the discussion that happened last year on our campus. Silence, considered to be one of Scorsese's best films of his career, focuses on two 17th century missionaries, if you recall, played by Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver, who go to Japan to find their mentor, risking their lives and their faiths. But, as many movies are, Scorsese's film is based on a book. The 1966 novel by the same name of Silence was written by Shusaku Endo, a Japanese Catholic novelist. Tonight, our speaker, Toshihiro, or Toppo, Takamura, will delve into the rekindled popularity of this author. His presentation, titled Shusaku Endo as a Theologian of the Cross, Silence Through a Lutheran Perspective, will focus on a Lutheran interpretation of the book and illustrate how both Rodriguez, the main character, and Endo himself are theologians of the cross. A few words about Toppo, our tonight's presenter. Toppo received his MA from the St. John's School of Theology and Seminary in 2003. He received his MDiv at Japan Lutheran Theological Seminary in Tokyo, where he was ordained in 2010. Toppo is now working toward a PhD degree in theology at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He is currently a resident scholar and Killian McDonnell OSB Fellow in Faith and Culture at the Collegeville Institute, and he will be with us through the end of this academic year. Please join me in welcoming Toppo Takamura.
Okay. Good evening and welcome. I guess before I start, I want to do a few things. One is that I want to acknowledge and give my gratitude to three old monks in particular, one deceased and the two alive. One is Father Elliot Tegel. I guess I probably have to turn this on first. Okay. First is Father Elliot, who died in 2003. He was very kind to me, and one of the things I remember about him is that toward the end of his life, he had to remove part of or one of his lungs, and he told me that he now became like Endo, who also had to remove part or one of his lungs, and that was something that I often remember. The second one is Kieran Nolan. I'm not sure if he's here, but doesn't look like. He came to my ordination in Japan, and that really made a good testimony to my colleagues, my fellow Lutherans, and I'm very grateful for that. And then third is, of course, Father Killian, who is not able to come this evening, but he read my article, and he approved it. So his confidence, I can give this lecture. So, and then also I would like to thank the monastic community, and then I have so much gratitude and appreciation to this monastic community, and I'm not able to name everyone, but please know that, and I'm very grateful. Well, Father Kevin said that we should never say anything unscripted. I'm not that strict, but I will very much stick to my script. So Shusaku Endo as a theologian of the cross, silence through a Lutheran perspective. introduction. I will use PowerPoint, but this PowerPoint, I guess it's not really PowerPoint, but it's a PDF format. But this is just to give you visual aid, and I'm not really utilizing it, so just so you know. Gerhard Forde, in his little book on being a theologian of the cross, asserts, therefore the theology of the cross is an offensive theology. The offense consists in the fact that, unlike other theologies, it attacks what we usually consider the best in our religion. If causing an offense against Christians is considered as a criterion for this theology, Shusaku Endo surely sets forth the theology of the cross in his once infamous novel, Silence. Indeed, through this work, Endo presents the theology of the cross, although he would not identify his thesis by such a term, challenging the conventional understanding of the Christian faith. In this lecture, I will examine Endo's Silence and see how it demonstrates itself as an articulation of the theology of the cross, and show that both Sebastian Rodriguez, the main character of the novel, and Endo are theologians of the cross. At the end, we will have about, hopefully, 15 minutes for questions. The lecture is based on my article, Sebastian Rodriguez in Shusaku Endo's Silence as a Theologian of the Cross, which was published last year in Dialogue, a theological journal. So what is the story of Silence? I assume that many of us have either read the book or seen the film or done both. But a quick review of the story is helpful. For those who have neither read the book nor seen the film, I hope this will give an idea what this is about. I will first show you an official trailer of the movie and then give a concise to-the-point summary of Silence, borrowing it from Bradley Holt's Thirsty for God. I will then point to some important scenes in the work to set the stage. Let's see. I didn't try, but hope this should work.
Our Lord said to them, "Go ye into the whole world and preach the gospel to every living creature."
Ferreira is lost to us. He denounced God in public and surrendered the faith.
That's not possible. Father Ferreira risked his life to spread our faith all over Japan.
It seems to me that our mission here is more urgent than ever. We must go find Father Ferreira.
This is in your hearts, then, both of you?
Yes.
Then I must trust God has put it down. The moment you set foot in that country, you step into high danger.
The price for your glory is their suffering.
It's too dangerous.
We asked for this mission. I pray, but I'm lost. Am I just praying to silence?
Okay, so the quote reads like this. Endo sets his novel in 17th century Japan when Christians, who had multiplied to some 300,000 after the visit of Francis Xavier in 1549, were suddenly persecuted after 1614. Endo's main character, a Portuguese Jesuit named Sebastian Rodrigues, faces the government's demand to renounce his faith by trampling on an image of the crucified Christ, a fumie. If he does apostatize to renounce his faith, Christian peasants suffering under torture will be released. At this point, the silence of God, which has troubled Rodrigues through all his time under persecution, is broken. The face of Christ appears to him and permits him to trample on Christ's face in order to save the peasants. Silence, or more precisely, what appears to Rodrigues as silence of God, plays a significant role in the story. Endo first introduces the silence of God in the scene of the martyrdom of two Japanese peasants. Witnessing with his colleague Francis Garpe their slow, torturous process of death in the sea, Rodrigues wrote, "They are martyred, but what a martyrdom! I had long read about martyrdom in the lives of the saints. How the souls of the martyrs had gone home to heaven, how they had been filled with glory in paradise, how the angels had blown trumpets. This was the splendid martyrdom I had often seen in my dreams. But the martyrdom of the Japanese Christians I now describe to you was no such glorious thing. What a miserable and painful business it was. The rain falls unceasingly on the sea, and the sea which killed them surges on uncannily in silence." A sense of unrest attacking Rodrigues is vividly expressed in his following words. "What do I want to say? I myself do not quite understand. Only that today, when for the glory of God, Mokichi and Ichizo mourned, suffered, and died. I cannot bear the monotonous sound of the dark sea gnawing at the shore. Behind the depressing silence of this sea, the silence of God, the feeling that while men raise their voices in anguish, God remains with folded arms." Silence. From here on, God's silence became gradually intensified in Rodrigues' thought as he, after his arrest and imprisonment, witnessed the death and the sufferings of a number of Christians, including those of Garpe, and in turn, silence from God. Rodrigues was repeatedly disturbed by the seemingly wretched, miserable, painful reality of martyrdoms and, more importantly, by the utter silence of God at these deaths for God's sake. He called upon God to break the silence and intervene, but with no avail. After Garpe's death, Rodrigues reflected on the silence of God in light of the crucifixion of Christ, contemplating on the question whether Christ uttered, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" as a prayer or out of fear in the fear of God's silence, face of God's silence. The story takes a new development after Rodrigues met Cristobal Ferreira, his former teacher and an apostate priest who now worked for the government, and reaches its climax as he faces psychological and spiritual torture. Ferreira leads Rodrigues to the fumie. Rodrigues thinks a simple copper medal is fixed onto a gray plank of dirty wood on which the grains run like little waves. Before him is the ugly face of Christ, crowned with thorns and the thin, outstretched arms. Eyes dimmed and confused, the priest silently looks down at the face which he now meets for the first time since coming to this country. Urged by the official who said to care about mere formalities and not about the actual denial of his faith, Rodrigues steps on the fumie. The priest raises his hood. In it, he feels a dull, heavy pain. This is no mere formality. He will now trample on what he has considered the most beautiful thing in his life, on what he has believed most pure, on what is filled with the ideals and the dreams of man. How his foot aches, and then the Christ is in bronze speaks to the priest. Trample, trample, I more than anyone know of the pain in your foot. Trample. It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross. The priest placed his foot on the fumie. The silence is finally broken by the unexpected voice of Christ inviting Rodriguez to trample on him. 5 years passed since Rodriguez stepped on the fumie. In his still ongoing struggling, Rodriguez now knew that his struggle was not merely over the issue of apostasy, but over the most fundamental issue of faith, who Christ truly was for him. Rodriguez thus confessed to Christ in his heart, I fell, but Lord, you alone know that I did not renounce my faith. He was aware that no fundamental difference existed between the apostate and himself, for they were both weak. Furthermore, Rodriguez now understood that his Lord was different from the God that is preached in the churches. Indeed, he knew, though gradually, that it was against his own faith that he had fought. It was with Christianity in his own heart. Endo concludes the main part of the story, stating that Rodriguez was now confident that his Lord was not silent. Rather, even if he had been, he was confident that Rodriguez's very life until this day would have spoken of the Lord. The appendix perhaps shows this broken silence of God, or God speaking through Rodriguez's life, as it refers to Kichijiro, another main character and the Judas figure in the story, who repeatedly renounced the faith but returned to it as Rodriguez's attendant and to his nebulous faith. So this is the plot of the story. Now I will talk a little about, potential themes in silence. So what are the main themes of silence? Is it theodicy, questions concerning the problem of evil? A cultural encounter between the East and the West, or inculturation of Christianity into the Japanese context? However, what is important to remember is that it is not the silence of God. The title of the work fools us, but Endo's intention is not to depict the silence of God in the lives of the faithful. Rather, he is proposing the voice of silence, or that God is always speaking to us, even if God appears to us silent. Endo, in an essay reflecting and commenting on silence after 25 years from the publication, asserts that the title was not what he originally intended. The book was indeed first advertised under a different title, Hinata no Nioi, which is the scent of a sunshine or the scent of a sunny place. Endo tried to communicate the yearning or desire of the weak for a sunny place, because as apostates, the weak were forced to live in shadow and were not allowed to access to such warmth. Endo gave up on the title, and the publisher thought that the book would not sell well with this title, but he regretted that he had complied with the advice. In silence, Endo wrestles with the issue of inculturation, adopting Christianity to Japan in such a way that the Japanese could accept it. To put it in another way, Endo was struggling over the integrity of his identity as both a Japanese and a Christian. Mark Williams states, increasingly concerned with the conflict and the tension created by his identity as a Christian, a Japanese, and an author. Endo's subsequent over represents a concerted attempt to retailor the ill-fitting suit of Western Christianity. So retailor the ill-fitting suit of Western Christianity into something more suited to his needs. Endo describes what he thought is unique to Japan and hinders the evangelization of Christianity as swamp. So swamp in Japanese is numa, and Endo employs this image to describe the religiosity of Japanese people. In silence, Endo elaborates on it twice, first through the mouth of Ferreira, and then that of Inoue, the chief inquisitor. The idea behind the choice of this word to describe the problematic nature of Japan against evangelism is that it makes Christianity and the Christian God rotten, twisted, and deformed over time. Reflecting on his long, tireless work as a missionary, Ferreira thus asserted with confidence, they did not believe in the Christian God. The Japanese to this day have never had the concept of God, and they never will. He continues, the Japanese are not able to think of God completely divorced from man. The Japanese cannot think of an existence that transcends the human. The Japanese imagine a beautiful, exalted man, and this they call God. They call by the name of God something which has the same kind of existence as man, but that is not the church's God. Ferreira is saying here that although it is Christianity in appearance, the content is different. In his book, published in 1970, Shichihei Yamamoto, under the pseudonym of Isaiah Bendason, proposed an intriguing thesis on the Japanese religiosity. He coined the term Nihonkyo, saying that Japanese people are believers of Nihonkyo, or the Japan religion. Needless to say, there is no official religion called Nihonkyo, but he insisted it as religion nonetheless. What Yamamoto tries to achieve is to name and articulate the religiosity or spirituality inherent to most, if not all, Japanese people. It is perhaps more accurate to say that Nihonkyo is a Japanese civil religion. Under this claim of Yamamoto, Christianity becomes something like a denomination of Nihonkyo, along with Buddhism and Shinto. The operating principle of Nihonkyo is anthropocentrism. Yamamoto even asserts that Nihonkyo has no theology but only anthropology. Furthermore, Yamamoto claims that what's central to Nihonkyo is communicated implicitly through nonverbal communication. Implications are clear. First, in and to this humanistic framework, Nihonkyo relativizes whatever that does not fit, the transcendence of God in the case of Christianity. Second, Nihonkyo is inaccessible to the non-Japanese people. The statement made by Endo through Ferreira and Inoue and the Nihonkyo of Yamamoto resemble to each other, and they seem to make the Japanese religiosity unique and the Japanese people unsusceptible to Christianity. Yet, is it really so? To put it differently, even if what Ferreira, Inoue, and Yamamoto have observed is true, is it really a uniquely Japanese problem? The translator's comment in the preface is here helpful. Johnston evaluates silence highly, finding its thesis applicable to the West and more universal than many of Endo's Japanese readers have suspected. Thus he asserts, for if Hellenistic Christianity does not fit Japan, neither does it, in the opinion of many, suits the modern West. If the notion of God has to be rethought for Japan, as this novel constantly stresses, so has it to be rethought for the modern West. If the ear of Japan is eager to catch a new strain in the vast symphony, the ear of the West no less attentive, searching for new chords that will correspond to its awakening sensibilities. All in all, the ideas of Mr. Endo are acutely topical and universal. which people, culture, society, and the nation do not relativize something in order to understand and accept it. Relativization is simply a natural process of making something formerly alien acceptable. Furthermore, if the transcendence of God is understood as something truly transcending the human existence, it cannot be accessible to anyone without the concept relativized to something intelligible to human capacity. Therefore, relativizing Christianity and the Christian God to Japanese context, or contextualizing them in Japan, is by itself not a problem. What then is the problem? The problem is that relativization is used in order to achieve an evangelical goal. In other words, one relativizes Christianity and the Christian God in order to understand them and, as a result, accept them. In this model, intellectual understanding precedes personal experience of or encounter with God. Endo in silence criticized this model and put forward an alternative by reversing the order. In this alternative model, as shown in the case of Rodriguez, one concretely experiences the overwhelming reality and inescapable love of God, and only then understand God through his life, both in retrospect and here and now. Here it becomes clear that the former model stands for the theology of glory, and the latter for the theology of the cross. Are you with me? Okay, very good. So I will talk about Rodriguez as a theologian of the cross. I will argue how Rodriguez is a theologian of the cross, and to do so I will use the works of two prominent Lutheran theologians and their works, Gerhard Forde on being a theologian of the cross, and Robert Jensen, A Religion Against Itself. The thesis of Endo's silence is summarized in the following words of Rodriguez after recantation. I know that my Lord is different from the God that is preached in the churches. Thus, Endo depicts the struggle of faith in Rodriguez as follows. It was against his own faith that he had fought, with Christianity in his own heart. In other words, silence is a description of Rodriguez's struggle over faith, that is to say, the religious discourse in which he was raised and trained, and his encounter with the alternative or genuine Christ who is for you. It is a clash between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. Forde asserts that despite all kinds of theology and religions existing in the world, there are on the bottom line only two kinds, glory theology and cross theology. Virtually all theologies and religions fall in the category of glory theology or the theology of glory, while the cross sets itself apart from and over against all of these. Forde warns against all the attempts and temptations to define and describe the theology or even a theology of the cross, for by so doing, one can set up another theology of glory, though under disguise. Theology of the cross is a mere description of the attack of the Word of God. Theology of the cross is a mere description of the attack of the Word of God, the doing of God to us, to the theology of glory. Yet, what exactly is the theology of glory? Forde briefly summarizes the mechanism of a theology of glory, saying, it operates on the assumption that what we need is optimistic encouragement, some flattery, some positive thinking, some support to build our self-esteem. Anyone who subscribes to this theology judges by appearances and so classifies work as good or bad. But that really means that such theologians see through the works to an eternal standard by which they are evaluated. They admit both imperfection of their works and the necessity of grace. But they nevertheless insist that there is good in them, and therefore their need for grace is merely a matter of degree. In other words, that goodness, however little it may be, gives credit to a human person for God's action, thereby divesting from God what is truly God's due. The theology of glory thus makes God a dispenser of grace or reactor to human goodness. Jensen, in his depiction of Nietzsche's assertion of death of God, defines this God as follows: the God who is the sum of all the gods and the values and the higher ideals of religion, the God who is the chief inhabitant and embodiment of religion's special world, existed only of the creation of our fears and dreams. He existed as the creation of our longing for an answer to our tale, in whose mind the conclusion of it could be already enacted. Rodriguez's understanding of God and religiosity consisted of this God and this religion, that is to say, the theology of glory. Naturally, his constant frustration in the face of persecution and martyrdom of Christians was precisely against this God and this religious mechanism and their failure. His expectation for a glorious spectacle of martyrs being received into the kingdom of heaven reflected his understanding of salvation based on God's covenant, which was typical of medieval soteriology. God was understood to have committed himself to justify man. This is a quote. God was understood to have committed himself to justify man, provided man first fulfilled a certain minimum requirement on his part. It is this fundamental principle which underlies the celebrated scholastic maxim, facienti quod inse est, des non denegat gratiam. So for those who have done or do what in themselves, God will not deny grace. So it is thus precisely when God refused or appeared so to do, Rodriguez was challenged to do. Okay, I won't do it again. It is thus precisely when God refused or appeared so to do, Rodriguez was challenged, and his confidence became shaken. It is this silence that so disturbed Rodriguez. Jensen admits, however, that the silence of God serves to Christians the real cause of pain. Yet at the same time, he points out that our experience of God is the experience precisely of his silence. This is the suffering with which Rodriguez struggled, the suffering accompanying God's undoing of his religiosity. Forty asserts that Luther speaks of suffering in this manner. The suffering Luther has in mind is something God inflicts on us just by virtue of the fact that he moves against the presumption of our works. He is out to do it all. We suffer this unilateral action of God. We suffer because we don't like it. We don't like to be put out of control. It means that we are rendered totally passive by the divine operation through the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. Appealing to the etymological connection between passivity and the suffering, which is passion, Fordy states, the sinner can only suffer the divine action. Therefore, it is clear that the silence of God which Rodriguez experienced was the experience of the divine action. Endo is thus describing in silence how this properly theological suffering and undoing of his theology of glory by the cross took place in Rodriguez. Rodriguez's struggle over his impotency before the suffering of Christian peasants for his sake clearly exhibits the frustration and eventual shattering of self-esteem as a priest. This is clear especially in Rodriguez's struggle in his cell immediately before his recantation. Endo illustrates this process in 2 steps. Rodriguez first felt consolidated in suffering with Japanese Christian martyrs, Carpe, and most importantly, Christ, while despising the sound of snoring, insensitively disturbing his most important moment in life. He thus turned his emerging theology of the cross into a negative theology of glory, which manifested pain as his work. This negative theology of glory, too, must be shattered by the cross, which, as a mirror, reflected before Rodriguez. I will just do it again. This negative theology of glory, too, must be shattered by the cross, which, as a mirror, reflected before Rodriguez his presence as a ubi martyr, and at the same time, revealed his utter powerlessness before those Christians suffering for his sake by making a growing noise, which he took as a rude, insulting sound of snoring. Thus, the final transformation started taking place in Rodriguez, as Forde asserts. God's hidden and alien working in the cross is such that it reflects back on us and exposes our own lives, that the works do not become the occasion for pride, but rather humility and despair. We are led, therefore, not to credit our own account, but to judge ourselves and to confess. The final thrust of the cross against Rodriguez's theology of glory came in the breaking of God's silence as he stepped on the humie, at his public renunciation and rejection of Jesus Christ. Yet, this is precisely the moment in which Christ was genuinely revealed as who he was before Rodriguez with these words, "Trample, trample. I more than anyone know of the pain in your foot. Trample. It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross." This controversial climax of the story described in A Priest Apostasy after his sincere struggle over faith finds its support in Jensen, who says, God exists for us precisely as the event of being rejected by us. I will say it again. God exists for us precisely as the event of being rejected by us. This should not be a surprise, for Jensen understands the pinnacle of the divine forgiveness as the forgiveness for unbelief, the gravest of sin. Put in other words, the gospel is that God loves the totally unlovely. This love of God creates ex nihilo God's beloved in sinners, and it thus logically follows that the sinner must be reduced to nothing in order to be saved. This is precisely what happened to Rodriguez as he stepped on the humie. For the first time, Rodriguez stood before God without anything which he could boast or rely on as a basis for his salvation, forced to let go of his piety and religion. Rodriguez's life after this recantation onward was thus anti-religious religion or religious anti-religion, with his religious hope precisely in the bankruptcy of religion. He was by faith hooked on the story of Jesus, being taught and inescapable. This inescapability from God, even by denying and rejecting God, captures the heart of justification by grace alone. In his later work, Deep River, Endo clearly articulates this overwhelming reality of God's commitment to human beings and their struggles by having Otsu, the main character, say, "Even if I try to abandon God, God won't abandon me." One important aspect of silence needs to be briefly discussed. It is about its descriptive nature. In this novel, Endo is describing a Portuguese Jesuit priest, Rodrigues, his inner struggle, faith, and life, or more accurately, struggle of life in faith. It shows the development of his faith through the undoing process of his religiosity. Endo is committed to depict this person's struggles and wrestling with God, how Rodrigues came to meet Christ for the first time without his imposed religious embellishment, being addressed in the second person and not as a bystander in the third person. One of Endo's fierce critics, Isaku Yanaihara, a professor at Dosha University, refuted Endo's writing by saying that neither Ferreira nor Rodrigues had a genuine faith from the beginning. Yet, it should be remembered that there is no positive assertion of Ferreira's faith and salvation in the novel. If one deduces the conclusion that silence is proposing the salvation of Ferreira and as its extension, the soteriological universalism, that person is misreading the story. What Endo is trying to accomplish is not a prescription for salvation. Rather, it is a description of an individual's life in faith that eventually becomes an embodiment of the axiom sola gratia, and that exemplifies what the cross does to this particular theologian of glory named Sebastian Rodrigues. In other words, it is a story not about the theology of the cross, a theology addressed to a general public, but about a theologian of the cross, Sebastian Rodrigues, and a series of concrete situations of his life. Here, Jensen's description of faith is helpful. He says, faith is the name of a situation. Faith is our name for finding ourselves in a particular situation and now having to live in it. It is our name for finding ourselves in the situation of having the gospel taught to us and having to deal with what it says about us. Faith is the situation of being together with Jesus in one historical space for action and decision, which comes about in the usual way, by being told about him. Thus, faith is a gift. For while it is I who live in this situation, it is not my act that put me there, but rather the act of someone else telling me the gospel. Thus, faith is saving, for our destiny is precisely to live roles in his action and the decision of love, and the faith is the happening of that. So faith is not about believing and accepting what the church teaches, nor believing what is unbelievable. Rather, it is our living out that reality of God's encountering us through Christ in a way betraying our pietistic assumptions and expectations. It is what enables us genuinely to struggle and wrestle with God, yet with a sense of peace and comfort. Now I have a few more to go, but then I will probably speed up a little. So with this understanding, and I will move on to the next point, that Shusaku Endo as a theologian of the cross, which is rather easy. This part that I just finished is probably the most difficult part. So Endo too is a theologian of the cross. Before embarking on this task, however, I will briefly elaborate on the difference between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross again, but in a slightly different manner. And then I will talk about what it means to be a theologian of the cross. The theology of glory can be described as a prescriptive theology or salvation by prescription. This theology gives human beings a prescription showing how they could attain salvation by telling them what they do. This approach has an appeal to the strong and their piety, for it leaves in the hands of individual Christians their salvation. Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer would define religion as a human attempt to reach God, and the theology of glory encourages this tendency in human beings. So religion as a human attempt to reach God. The theology of the cross, however, is a descriptive theology or description of the divine salvation in the life of individual Christians. It describes how God is working in each person's entire life, and the theologian of the cross pays attention to how the reality of God and God's salvation are enacted and actualized in the reality of this world. It is, Barth and Bonhoeffer would put it, God's reaching down to the humanity. The cross reveals God who embraces the weak with their weakness. So silence is Endo's attempt to describe the divine activity in the weak, those who are remembered in history and by the church as failure. Endo is asking if faith was only in the strong. Endo's answer is a clear no. God was and is present and active in the weak and in their failure. This single fact seems to attest Endo's being a theologian of the cross. But then I will say more. It is important to remember that Silence was first published in 1966, but Endo's description of the European Christianity reflects that before the Second Vatican Council, and therefore he is primarily reacting to the pre-Vatican II Catholicism. This seems obvious since the story of silence takes place in the 17th century. But what I'm trying to say is that silence is partly Endo's autobiography as a Japanese Catholic Christian who came to faith through his mother. In other words, not by his own choosing, and lived his young adulthood during the Second World War when Christians were treated with hostility. Endo's Christian faith or identity was neither strong enough to be defended against persecution nor weak enough to be abandoned. In the essay mentioned earlier, Endo admits that all the main characters of Silence, Rodriguez, Ferreira, Kichijiro, and even Inoue, the chief inquisitor, are himself. Endo says that they coexisted in him, and in the process of writing, they became independent as different characters. Yet, it is still fair to say that Rodriguez is the primary embodiment of Endo. This is implied by Rodriguez's nickname by children at the end of the story, Apostate Paul, for Endo's Christian name was Paul. This naturally leads to another question: who would be then Ferreira, Apostate Peter? Ferreira embodies a Spanish priest who was very close to Endo from his childhood to the young adulthood. He was a missionary in Japan during and after the war and played a fatherly role in Endo's life. The priest was strong and strict and tried to teach Endo to be strong also. And although Endo could not meet the expectations but keep disappointing him, he nonetheless had a strong respect to him. He eventually left priesthood and disappeared from the church after marrying to a Japanese woman. This was seen as scandal and a failure by the church. Endo wrote in his short novels his indirect encounter with this priest long after he left the church, depicting how Endo was moved by seeing this priest quickly making a sign of the cross before eating, and realizing that the priest still lived his Christian faith, but in a different way, as a weak. The name, or the Christian name of this priest was Peter. In this sense, Endo is telling his own story and the story of this priest, and so doing, he is trying to restore a place of this priest among the faithful. This too demonstrates that Endo deserves to be called a theologian of the cross. So the conclusion. Endo's struggle over his identity as a Japanese Christian and wrestling with Christianity in its appropriation and contextualization forced him to fix his gaze on the Christ on the cross, the God who spoke in silence. Endo, who lived the Christian faith concretely in his context, did not abstract this God or present it as an idea or an ideal. Rather, he described it in a tangible manner through the life of Sebastian Rodriguez, who in his suffering finally had God's silent voice or voice in silence. In other words, silence is an articulation of Sebastian Rodriguez as a theologian of the cross, undone of his piety and religiosity, which blinded him from the genuine encounter with Christ. Therefore, if it is read through the cross, the peculiar nature of this book can be understood as an attack of the cross against the theology of glory. So, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. And I hope that it was something that fruitful or beneficial for you that I said. So, and we'll have.
We do have some time for questions and answers.
Should we start with Benedict? Father Thomas. Okay, Father Thomas, please.
I find it very interesting that the only people who preserved Christianity were the ones who tread on the cross and did it every year.
Right.
As I understand it, while they knew, that all the other families around them also were retaining their faith, my guess is that they couldn't converse about it. They couldn't try to make I don't know what you call it, a real theology out of it, but simply had to live with this with that strong sense of retaining Jesus, but
Thank you. So what Father Thomas was saying was this group of Christians, and it's like it's underground Christians during national seclusion in Japan, and they are called hidden Christians or kakure Kirishitan. And what they had to do every year was to renounce their faith in public. And after that, they had a way to bring that person back into the community, but because all the priests were gone, that they had to do as a laity. So they chose among themselves someone who was able to do baptism, basically, and then I guess sacrament of penance. And that's how it was. And then they, of course, existed without celebrating Eucharist during these years, which was about 200 years or over 200 years. And unfortunately, when national seclusion ended, these Christians came in public, and they also had to go through some persecutions, but because I guess the baptismal formula that they are using was not quite accurate, that they were denied as Christians, so which was a very sad story. So some part of the community, or these Christians, came back to Catholic faith, but we still have people, descendants of Catholic Christian to this day, because they just couldn't accept the fact that their ancestors were not part of the salvation that they want to be. So this is very challenging. And one thing that I wanted to talk about, and Endo is very keen about, is the motherhood of God. Against, I guess, Western Christianity, which he saw as fatherly expression or articulation of Christianity, Endo was trying to say that, I guess, motherly aspect of Christianity needs to come forth in order for Japanese to accept Christian faith. And then I think this motherly understanding or the motherly aspect, I think, is strongly fostered through the experience of Catholic Christian, the hidden Christians, who had to deny their faith in public every year. So, thank you for that. Dr. Galbraith.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a wonderful journey into the theology of the cross in Simon. I'm particularly thankful for what you've given me. I've always struggled with exactly what Endo is attempting to reject in science, and theology of glory, I think, just captures that perfectly. It really does, so thank you. My question is about the theology of the cross. And I'm sure there's a way that this fits, but I'm just struggling with how, so if you can help me. It seems to me when Rodriguez recounts, at the center of that is the suffering of other people. And ultimately, to be open to the suffering of others, he must reject that theology of glory. But he also must be truly active in the relief of that suffering. And that part just doesn't fit for me with the passivity we're talking about of the theologian of the cross. So if you could just help me with that aspect, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a very challenging, I guess, question. I think one of the problems with Lutheran theology is, of course, our emphasis on passivity, but how we experience it as Christians is, by active engagement. But we can theologize our experience only in retrospect, I think, and then make sense out of it. So in a sense that what you're saying is right, that he is actively taking action to prevent further suffering of Japanese peasants. It's described as Japanese Christians, but it's clear from the novel that they have already renounced their faith. So they are forced to continue to suffer just for the sake of Rodriguez. And then, these people had no way to save themselves. So it was solely relying on Rodriguez. And I think many people also take that interpretation that Rodriguez was strong or he's showing strong faith to break that, I guess, suffering, and then being, I guess, sympathetic or being together with the sufferers. But I think in the next chapter or the next scene, Rodriguez does admit that he was weak, and that was the reason why he, recounted. So I think his self-reflection, I think it is also important that there is a sense of his weakness that was that led him to I guess, denial of Christ in public. But at the same time, and I always think that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian from the Second World War, he talks about this idea, vicarious representative. The idea is that we take some action for the sake of others for these others to form community. But the person who is taking actions are removed from that community, just like Bonhoeffer did with his life. So he was involved in assassination plot against Hitler, and that was a violation for him and his commitment as pacifist. But he thought that that was necessary action. And then this idea, and then also there was no way that he could be part of that community after committing that assassination, but then he was nonetheless taking that step. And then I often associate that with Rodriguez in this scene. So I guess I don't really have a good answer. It's a real challenge, I think, for Lutherans, how we can, I guess, stick to the passivity of action. I think the difference is that what God is doing and how we are experiencing, or how we appear to be doing in this world. So I'm sorry, it's not a satisfying answer, but Rani?
I think that Luther's distinction between coram Deo and coram Habemus helps on this, because when he's talking about the paradoxicality of the theology of the cross, he's mainly talking about it in relationship to God, and that we cannot come to God. God comes to us, but our intrinsic temptation is to try to come to God on our own merit, or on at least even to the showing of how strong our faith is. But that becomes an idol, becomes a form of a work, and so it becomes an expression of a theology of glory. But then to use a spatial imagery, that's the vertical. But the horizontal is then expressing that grace in loving service to the neighbor. So, borrowing from Galatians, Luther says that the faith must be active in love. And so the activity comes not to please God, but in response to what God has already done. One of Ferdy's favorite phrases, I had several courses from him, was, now if there's nothing you have to do, what will you do? In other words, you do it out of love and you do it out of grace. You don't do it out of proving anything to someone else or even to yourself, much less to God.
My dissertation advisor often says he's in his retirement. He says that now he lives in retirement and he has nothing he has to do. So, he can do what he wants to do, and which is a service, for others. So that just reminded. Then I noticed, I guess the time is running, but I guess I point Benedict to ask probably the last question. I'll be here after the lecture, so if you're interested in talking to me, please do.
Sure. Thanks for your very rich and lucid lecture. I haven't read the book, but I've seen the film. And I understand that at the end of the film, Scorsese changed one of the images where he's clasping a crucifix in a covert way as he's buried. And I was wondering what your take on that is, that little shift, maybe not so little.
So this is also the issue Dr. Galbraith brought up when we were talking some months ago. I guess, to be honest, and I didn't like it, and Dr. Galbraith also didn't like it. But I think it's a theatrical, I guess it probably compromise is not the right word, but I guess adoption. It makes sense in the framework of film. And then I think, well, let us admit that the book is very disturbing, probably more disturbing than the film. And the film gives sense of, I think, cathartic moment, which enable us to, I guess, go back home safely. So I went to watch this film with the retired Lutheran pastor, and he had to sit in his car for good 15-20 minutes before he could start driving because it was so depressing. But the novel is even more depressing. So, but I think that depressing, maybe not so much the depressing part, but I think the depression or sense of depression comes from the uneasy answer that Endo is proposing. And I think that's very important. And unfortunately, the film is giving, I think, Scorsese's interpretation or conclusion to the issue he thought most important, which for me is that it's a cultural clash between the West and East, and I think he's kind of showing, or it could mean that he was showing that Rodriguez, who in his report to his colleagues, Jesuit colleagues, that he sensed something uneasy about Christian faith, which is that these Japanese are attached to faith objects. And I think the Scorsese is almost saying that he accepted, Rodriguez at the end of his life accepted that form of Christian faith. And I think the significance is that that object was given by one of the martyrs earlier in the film, and I think that makes, I guess, sandwich structure. But again, I appreciate what Scorsese did and gave a sense of hope, but wasn't necessarily sure because it seems to contribute to Theology of Glory for me, that what he did. So.
Well, please join me in offering our thanks.